Hello, friends, and welcome to Momentum Boost. I'm your host, Adrienne Gold-Davis, and I'm very grateful that you're joining us today. So in order to ask our guests a question, which you're going to want to do, just click the question mark that's on the lower left side of the chat box, okay? So in today's Boost, we're exploring modern day anti-Semitism and how to combat it with Irving Roth and Shari Dollinger. Today's Boost is sponsored by Francine and Robert Lipstein of Marion Station, Pennsylvania. Now, Francine's mother, Sally Chase of blessed memory, was a Holocaust survivor, and she was a beautiful, proud woman who was dedicated to education about the Holocaust. She was a true inspiration, so thank you so much for your generosity. First, let me tell you about Irving Roth. He's a Holocaust educator and a survivor, the director of the Holocaust Resource Center at Temple, Judea in Manhasset, New York. He's also the author of Bondi's Brother, a story of love, loss, and betrayal and liberation. It's a blessing, to hear the voice of a survivor at any time, particularly now that there are so few left. This is our opportunity to listen and to bear witness. Shari Dollinger is the co-executive director of Christians United for Israel, or CUFI. Before CUFI, she was the assistant director of the Donor Forum and as the officer for interreligious affairs at the Embassy of Israel in Washington, D.C. So CUFI, they produced this film, Never Again, that stars Irving Roth, who you'll soon be meeting. You're going to want to see this movie. You're definitely going to want to see it. And today, Momentum gets to bring you the inside scoop and some advanced clips. So I'd like you to first take a look at this.
It all begins with words uttered by individuals, repeated by others, and became a philosophy, an ideology.
When you become anything without realizing that it's happening, it's called brainwash.
I hated America. The Jews were the reason for all the evil in the world.
This we must not allow to happen again.
Oh, Shari. Shari, first of all, I want to say congratulations, Mazel Tov, on producing such an incredible piece of historic significance. But I want to do first is I want to look at the history of anti-Semitism and its perennial reoccurrences. You would have thought that after the Holocaust, that would be the end of it, that we wouldn't be listening to this kind of stuff anymore, that we had used up all the hatred in the world. And yet here we are again, and you're producing a film about anti-Semitism. Do you think you could discuss from your perspective why you think that's so?
So Adrienne, first of all, thank you for having me. I love seeing your face. I shared with you last week that you've been a ray of light to me personally and to our whole community with your podcast and Boost. So thank you for
Thank you,
all
Shari.
of that.
Thank you.
Really. So, had you told me 3 years ago, a year and a half ago, that we'd be producing a movie on anti-Semitism, I'd say, why really? Thank God we live in the safest country in history for Jews. There's no need. And then Pittsburgh happened. And then attacks kept on happening. And you see the statistics from the ADL. And it is not only unnerving, it's scary. I grew up in a very small Jewish community in Kansas City, and never once did I experience even a hint of anti-Semitism. And unfortunately, my children are living in a different world. And so instead of just standing by and throwing up our hands at CUFI, we decided we needed to do something serious. And our response was this film. And, God willing, in another 10, 20 years, I would say, no, we don't need to make a film about anti-Semitism. But sadly, right now, the reality is that we do with the resurgence that we're seeing. And we are hopefully, believing that this film will reach millions and not only explain what we're currently experiencing, but the history of anti-Semitism.
So, Shari, is this a new anti-Semitism in your mind? I mean, I remember growing up and we had like a grace pass for a while. People were too ashamed to let that out. But now we hear anti-Zionism is a very separate thing from anti-Semitism. And of course, we know that that isn't the case. Do you think it's a new format? Are we looking at something newfangled, or is this just the old stuff recycled, repackaged in a new way?
So thank you, and I really appreciate you bringing up anti-Zionism, because people hide behind the big leaf of anti-Zionism. And they
Mhm.
say, no, I'm not anti-Semitic. I don't dislike Jews. I just don't like Israel. Well, if there's only one country in the entire world that you dislike, and that happens to be the Jewish state, turns out you might be an anti-Semite. I mean, it's if you have a list of 20 countries that you dislike, it's a different conversation. But when you specifically pull out the Jewish people and you hold us up and say, you, I am going to persecute, and you, I am going to inflict harm against, then yes, it's one and the same. And so, unfortunately, every generation sees anti-Semitism in a new light. In this emergence of anti-Zionism and the reemergence of I'd say old school anti-Semitism with swastikas being sprayed on synagogues and synagogue shootings. I mean, who would have thought in this country in this season? But the silver lining is that there are millions and millions and millions of Americans that care deeply and are with us and supporting us in these really dark times.
Clearly, and clearly CUFI is one of them. But Sherry, I have to say that I always thought, like I said earlier, I thought we'd get a free pass, and clearly that isn't the case. Um, Whoops. Can you see me okay?
I can see your beautiful face.
Oh, well, that's the most important thing. I think, you went on a momentum trip. You're a momentum sister. You had that incredible experience where you understand that at Momentum, the principle of unity without uniformity is a formative and underlying value for us. So the thing is that whole global sisterhood that we've created in embracing that, this has been your entire life's work, obviously, not just with CUFI, but what you did before. So I'm curious to you as a Momentum sister, but as a mother yourself, separate and apart from the work you do in the world, how do we as mothers ensure that our families work towards that principle of never again? Some people are afraid to frighten their children. Some people say the more information they have, the better. As a mom, what do you think the direction is to go?
So I love, the unity without uniformity. And that's where the power is. Because as a people, we are, statistically insignificant when you look at the world population. And we need those that are outside our community to come alongside us and to support us in these times specifically. But really, this is where the power of communities comes forth. And I think a lot of the division that we're seeing in our country is because we're siloed. We only read certain newspapers, other people read other newspapers, and we have no common language anymore. And so, what I really encourage my family to do is to take off our blinders and to really try to understand by listening to what people are saying. And that's how we learn. And we've lost that common denominator. And as a mom, as a Momentum participant, this film and what I do is really one and the same. It's all part of the same conversation. At our dinner table, we can jump from, what's going on in Israel to, unfortunately, what's going down, could be down the street from us at Emory University. And these are all intertwined. Just as the world has become a lot smaller, so have the issues. And it's imperative that we have these conversations with our kids. From the earliest of ages, our children understood. I mean, my husband and I met at APAC, so not surprisingly, we're raising very strong Zionists. But they understood what it meant to be all the positive, beautiful things about Judaism. I don't want them to identify just because, they hate us, let's go and eat. I mean,
Right.
that's not a Jewish identity, it doesn't make, but that we have such a beauty, the beauty that you speak of and you bring to the world, through your podcast. That's what I want my children to hear. And then they're going to be in a position to want to defend what they love versus just defending something because it's mandated they defend it.
Wow. Yeah, it's a deep answer. I want to ask you this as well. Do you think that anti-Semitism, or, the film talks about an absolute kind of apathy towards it? So people just don't care anymore. It's not sexy anymore. There are other movements that are more interesting, something we want to get ourselves around. And one of the things I've noticed, and personally have felt a kind of resentment about is that, every manner of oppression and bigotry is in the forefront, and it should be, Shari. It should be. There is so much wrong in the world, but for some reason, no one cares about the Jews. And so I just need to know, do you think that apathy is learned, as in there's an undercurrent of they always come back, they always rise to the top, so they don't need our help? Or do you think it's just a passive thing, post Holocaust? What do you think?
So I think it's honestly, it's a different response in different communities. And so after Pittsburgh, I made it a point to bring my son, who at the time was 10, to San Antonio. We were having a student training with 180 college activists from around the country. And
Mhm.
I often say to my children, we are not alone in this fight. There are almost 10 million CUFI members. There are hundreds of millions of people around the world who deeply and passionately care about the Jewish people. What you're seeing is the abomination and the margins. And so I needed him to be in a room of 180 students who just love the Jewish people in Israel. And so, from where I sit, thank God, I don't see the apathy, because when there is an attack or something happens in Israel, more often than not, I hear it from my Christian colleagues who follow the Israeli press even more than I do, which, as my kids can tell you, I'm glued to. And so, what we view our mission as is the fire that my colleagues at CUFI have, our members, to just spread it. And we start from a position of strength with 10 million members. And so, yes, apathy is a real issue. Thank God it is not as much of an issue as those of us kind of in the Jewish community who don't necessarily live in other bubbles, other communities as much, may be led to believe. Because, when I walk into a CUFI summit with 5,000 Christians from all 50 states, you feel the love. And for me, that's the silver lining in this season, that we have
I
so many
hear that.
friends.
I hear that. I mean, and it's a wonderful thing. But what I'm concerned about? I'm concerned about our own children who
Mm.
have internalized so much Israel bashing in the form of anti-Zionism that really they internalize in their youth as anti-Semitism that makes them self-loathing. Why else would Jewish children go and support causes that hate Jews? What is it? And this is not a new phenomenon. Even before the Holocaust and during that time, there were Jews who felt like, well, you can't beat him, join him. I've had my own children over different times in their lives say things to me like, well, maybe there's a reason we hate us. Maybe we're too tribal. Maybe we're too this. Maybe we only take care of ourselves. And it doesn't matter how many statistics you give them that say that's not true. In fact, the majority of donors to non-Jewish causes are actually Jews that we hold up the world with our philanthropy and so on. It creates a kind of self-loathing. And I see what you're saying. You bring your children into places where lots of people are going to love them, and they feel better about themselves, but then they go back into the mainstream school systems and they start to feel like, well, I don't want to be hated. I don't have enough of identity yet to handle that kind of negativity. And oh, well, if I can't beat them, I'll join them. And we see that, and it terrifies me. It
I couldn't
terrifies me
agree.
from the inside. I'm wondering, would it be okay if we took a look at one of the clips
Of
right now,
course.
the one about persecution? Maybe I can ask Tal, who is our technical producer, to pull that up, and let's just take
One day
a
I'm carrying my friend's
little
book,
emotional break and take a look at that.
and she looks at me and she says, I don't want you to carry my books. In fact, I don't want to talk to you anymore. I say, why? Because you're a Jew. And my father told me, A, not to be friendly with a Jew. Socially, it's unacceptable. And B, you're evil. In fact, you as a Jew are responsible for every single thing that goes wrong in the world. Thus begins the transformation of society on an individual basis. Things have changed. I'm no longer the same person as I was before. I haven't changed, but the world is changing around me. And thus begins the slippery slope of persecution of Jews, in particular, the persecution of Irving Roth.
Tell me a little bit about Irving Roth, please. Emily. There's two big players in this film. Irving Roth, of course, and the gentleman who was formerly an Islamist, angry, indoctrinated young man. What can you tell me about Irving Roth?
Where can I start? I just involuntarily smile when I speak of Irving, and hopefully he'll be able to join us in a couple of minutes. So Irving just celebrated his 91st birthday. He has more energy than any 40-year-old I know. We, CUFI, first encountered Irving when we brought a group of high school students to Poland about 10 years ago. And, the story is told to me that, the students came over on the flight and, were trying to, they were exhausted and they were going up to their rooms. And all of a sudden, Irving comes bounding down the elevator and says, "All right, where are we going?" And that's just Irving. I mean, we've had to tell Irving, you can only do 3 events a day. And so really the amount of love, and his soul is brighter than most that he brings into the world. And the fact that he is, talks of the horrors that he experienced, his relationship with his brother, which is beautiful and poignant and heartbreaking, that everybody needs to hear Irving's story. We were privileged to bring our children to his Holocaust Museum on Long Island, and Irving sat there for 90 minutes, and our kids were about 9 and 10 at the time, explaining the Holocaust, not in scary terms, but in 9 and 10-year-old terms that will stick with them forever.
Tell me what
And that
that
relates.
sounds like, Shari. Tell me what it
So
sounds like to explain it to 9 and 10-year-olds that doesn't terrify them, because so many parents are afraid of this particular piece of education and you can't teach never again unless you know what the again was.
And I have to tell you, I was too. I was very nervous. So, obviously he did not talk about the crematoriums. He didn't talk about the gas chambers. He talked about it in very personal terms, like the story of with the girl, his girlfriend, who wouldn't carry his books anymore. He also makes sure that he talks about the fact that he's reunited with his parents at the end of the Holocaust, which you never hear that story. So that way, when our kids dive further into Holocaust education, when they're older, they're not going to be terrified. I know I was probably introduced to it in a not in a terrifying way, and it made me run from it for quite a few years.
Sure.
And so I think it's important at first that you talk about it from a historic perspective, and he does that beautifully when he talks about World War II and the lead up and all of what you just saw in the film in terms of the anti-Jewish sentiment that was building and that it was building, and that it starts with words, because words to children are less scary than actions. But as we know, and with the whole movie, the premise is it starts with words, but it never ends there. And so if the children understand the backstory, you don't need to go to the through story immediately when they're 9 and 10, but when they're older, then they're going to be able to pick up that story. And it's similar to the question that you just asked me, and just to follow up on it, how do we combat this apathy amongst our own? I think Momentum and Lori and the group of 8 has the answer, and it's bring them to Israel, because you are never the same. It is cliche, but it's true. I wouldn't be doing the work I'm doing if I didn't go to Poland when I was 16 and went on to Israel with March of the Living. I wouldn't have the same fire and passion for Judaism if it weren't for all the time that I spend in Israel. And so for all of the work that we do as a community, we need to channel it into our youth spending significant amount of time so that they're exposed to the beauty and the life and the love that Israel has, and they aren't just talking about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust.
I'll tell you something interesting. I'm not sure I've ever shared this before, certainly not publicly, but I grew up in a pretty secular home, but proud Jews, just not particularly proactive about anything. I remember, all of the Israel milestones were marked, but I remember that my education about being a Jew was limited to they hate us. And so if you scratch beneath the surface, because my mother, came after the war to Canada, and if you scratch under the surface, that's what you're going to get. So it was a sort of an us, them thing. What I would have preferred, and I wonder what you think about this, is to be raised with what it means to be Jew, what our role is in the world. To me, you combat anti-Semitism by telling your children and anyone who listens that the Jews' job in the world, and the reason we're the canary in the coal mine, is to be able to tell the world we are here to ensure the pillars of Jewish values of tzedakah, or charity, as it's often incorrectly translated, as activism, as loving your neighbor as yourself. If we were teaching our children what it means to be a Jew, and we could say to them, and you know what, there's a lot of people out there who don't want to live in that way, and they're going to hate you because you do. What do you think about going at it from that direction?
I couldn't agree with you more. And I had a conversation about 4 years ago that haunted me. That a woman just said, you know, she had kids herself and she was in her 30s. And she just said, I'm done with Judaism. It's just a continual, they hate us, they hate us, they hate us. And what am I defending? And that is the answer. And it took me a little bit to formulate it and get deeper into my Jewish learning as an adult to realize, what is she talking about? You know, we have so much light and learning to give to the world. And in our Jewish education, that's what we should be talking about, tzedakah. We should be talking about the beauty in Torah study. We should be talking about, if you're looking for spirituality, look no further than your roots. And I know that you had an author on recently, Sarah
Right.
Horowitz, and she talks about this beautifully. And I think the title of the book is something along the lines of, you know, I finally looked, you know, to Judaism for what I, you know, for what I needed, and it's all right there. And because we don't talk about God and we don't talk about spirituality in our Jewish day schools, kids find it somewhere else. And yes, I love yoga, but I'm not looking for yoga for spirituality. But a lot of Jewish kids do, because we're not giving them what they're craving.
You are so right. The thing, it's funny you should say that about the yoga thing too. I was saying to somebody the other day, you know, you can get on a yoga mat, and a lot of women get on a yoga mat because they want that long, lean thigh muscle and those beautiful arms that yoga creates. But yoga was not created to be
Mhm.
about aesthetics. That is the practice of the spiritual position of it. And in Judaism, you know, it's not enough to just sort of to identify as they hate us, now let's eat, as you put. You cannot identify, and today's youth cannot identify as the other. So it is up to the mother, I think, in the family. And I think that in some ways it's so hard, but I think that I think we have to go out there and give them something to be proud of. So I believe we're fortunate enough to have Irving with us.
Tremendous.
All right, so let's see what we can do about bringing Irving on as well. And when we get Irving on, what I actually would really, really like to do, if I could, is I would love to show the clip, Tal, of Irving and his speaking about his brother, because I think that that will certainly open up the conversation in a way that will help you understand Irving's heart and soul and open up the conversation. So let's do that for a moment, if we can.
I did say goodbye to him. I remember the day. Because up to that point, I always had someone to lean on, someone to speak to, would give me hope, would encourage me. What am I to do alone? I continued talking to him, though he wasn't there. I would ask myself, what would he say? He wasn't evil. All the stories that people make up throughout the world about the Jew, my brother. Gentle, kind, sweet human. All the lies today on the airwaves. He committed no crime. Yet, hundreds of thousands of people who guarded this place, consider him to be vermin. This gentle, sweet human.
Oh, dear God. You know, in some ways, he brings the personal into it. I wonder how much of his journey was informed and his decision to be an educator was informed by keeping his brother's memory alive. I think that this film, what it does is that it opens up that space for this conversation again. If we said never again, we meant never again. But how do you mean never again? So mothers like you and I, Shari, the 20,000 plus women and men who went on momentum trips, and everybody listening now, Jew or Christian, any race, it's up to us, Irving. It is up to us to figure out
Okay,
how
I'm
to
gonna hang up
imagine
now.
that your brother is our brother. How do we do that, Irving? You've managed to come to a place of forgiveness, and this is something I don't understand.
That's not what I said.
Okay, tell
There's
me.
a difference. There's a difference between reconciliation and forgiveness.
Explain.
Now, the reason that's a very important thing to me, because forgive, if you look at the definition of forgive, means we're starting from a new slate, from a clean slate. We can't do that because we already have experience. We have lived through things. We have hurt each other. And the only thing we can do, the thing we must do, is reconcile. Understand that we made mistakes and say, I reconcile. I know what I've done wrong. And now we can not begin all over again, but establish a harmonious relationship, which is
Okay,
totally different from forgiveness.
100%, because I understand from a Jewish perspective, nobody can forgive anyone except the person who did it unto them.
Exactly.
Help me understand reconciliation. What does that look like? And when you educate, what kind of action steps do you take towards that?
The active step is when I have a disagreement with someone or we have trouble between each other, we sit back and we talk. And we all, both of us recognize that we have done something wrong, or one of us recognizes. So first thing you have to do is recognize I've done something wrong. I've made wrong decisions. I did not look at my moral compass, and I will change. And that change is what's required. That change is what's required.
But Irving, do you find that most people have a clear moral compass in this day
No,
and age?
no, I
So
do not.
how do we have that? How do we do it?
We must do it because, look, today, a gentleman by the name of Arakat is in a hospital in Jerusalem because he has the coronavirus. Now he is in the Hadassah hospital in an induced coma. Arakat was the man who is responsible to a great extent to giving money to murderers, to people who have been terrorists. He established that whole thing with the help of others. Yet at the moment, he is in the hospital, in a Jewish hospital in Hadassah in Jerusalem. Now, what's required of him to do, should he come out of this, to say, oops, everything I have done, everything I have said, my desire to destroy Israel was all wrong. He must say that. Until he says that, you can't reconcile.
Of course not. But let's be
So this is
honest,
what
Irving.
all right, let me tell you what I ask.
Okay.
What I ask for, since the Holocaust really began a long time ago, it really began in Germany and France. Two German, one a member of parliament in 1870 or 1880, wrote a thesis and coined the word, the Jews are our misfortune, which became the buzzword for the Nazi army, for the Nazi world. And the only thing you can do is to destroy them. Thus, this they must renounce. For Germany to become a partner, they have to renounce the Nazi ideology, which they officially have done. And so we have reconciled. Germany and the Jewish people officially have reconciled. They have changed their ways. Denying the Shoah is something which is criminal in Germany, and therefore we can begin our relationship. That's what's required. But as long as you say, well, Hitler was right, except he didn't accomplish his mission, he did not get rid of the Jews, that does not lead to reconciliation. And as long as Hamas and Hezbollah is there to try and destroy the Jewish people, there is no reconciliation. There's no agreement. There's no peace. The rejection of that must take place. Until you reject that, you can't go on.
Well, academically speaking, intellectually speaking, what you're saying is absolutely true. We know that. But there's a death by a million little cuts, right? And human beings move through the world with all kinds of small psychological, emotional holocausts, little reconciliations. And anti-Semitism is sort of the endless reminders of those tiny little cuts. What do you suggest? And Shari shared some wonderful thoughts. What do you suggest, even before reconciliation? What do you suggest?
I will tell you what we suggest. It's what I do in some of my talks. When I have people who jump in the middle of my talk or at the end of my talk and say, but you murdered people, you murdered children, you're a rapist. I say, that's interesting, good, get it off your chest. Now let's stay with facts. Let's go and look at historical facts. What did each one of us do? And say, yes, we have done things, both of us have done things which weren't quite appropriate. Let's recognize we've done something wrong, and let's not do it again, or let us not continue doing it. But as long as we continue shouting at each other with lies, we can't get any place. That's where we are. Now, this is the problem that we face today on the college campus. Professors and students are lying, putting together things that have never happened. There are people today, look, when the Pope in around 1990 came to Syria, the Syrian president gave a speech. And in his speech, he said the following: as your highness knows, these people, the Jews, the Zionists, have been murdering our children for thousands of years to bake matzah, and they continue doing it. As long as you have that, there is no issue. There is no reconciliation. And unless we get out of that mode, it doesn't matter what you do. Look, there's a point at which there was a conference taking place, I think in Way, or one of those places in New York, in the United States, and the Palestinian negotiators, including Arafat, asked for certain things. He wanted, and Israel said, the prime minister said, yes, we'll give you 96% or 95% of every inch of ground, plus the other 6-7% will give you another piece to make it that you're getting 100% of what you want. You can establish your capital in Jerusalem. All you have to do is stop saying no. And what happened is we got second Antifada. This is humbug, because their objective is not peace. Their objective is not to build a state. Their objective is not to worry about their people. Their objective is to stay where we are, because now, without a state, they have total control of the money they get.
Okay, hold on a second. I hear what you're saying. And if you go on the internet and it's interesting because Facebook just this week, Mark Zuckerberg just created a ruling that there can be no Holocaust denial anymore. But my experience, Irving, is that if you are taking a sort of Talmudic approach and the Hillel and Shammai and listening to both sides approach, there is facts, and then there is an emotional perspective that feels like a fact. And there are people on the other side who have their whole other agenda with their whole other set of what they call facts. So I'm curious. I want to ask both of you a question for a minute. Shari, I'm going to just start with you for a second. When it comes to speaking about facts, and I'm asking you both, how do we ensure that our children find an objective definition of fact? Because if we're going to fight anti-Semitism, what Irving is saying, if there's ever going to be reconciliation, there must be objective fact. But in a land and a time of such profound subjectivity, what do you as a mother, Shari, teach your family what it means to search out and decide what is truth? And then Irving, I want you to respond to.
Yeah,
Shari, you're first.
for us, this is where we go back to the sources. And I'm actually in my parents' house right now, and you see behind me the, Judaica, Encyclopedia Judaica. And you literally, you go back to the Torah, you go back to the sources, and you need a solid foundation so that when you encounter things in 2020 that may not make sense, because really this 2020 makes sense, that you have the Talmudic, the Torah basis of deciding, like you said before, the weighing the options and having an intelligent conversation. But if your entire political knowledge is the last 4 years or the last 8 years, or your knowledge of history expands, only 90 seconds in a CNN top 10, then really, how can you have a conversation? And so there needs to be a depth of understanding, and we also need to have a broad array of what we're reading, so that we can break out of the bubbles we were talking about before and understand others' perspectives, while knowing, who we are informs what we believe.
Beautiful. And you, Irving, where does one find objective facts today?
You can't unless you're willing to study. Now, I do crazy things. One of the things I do is I listen to broadcasts. Al Jazeera, I listen to BBC, CNN, JBS. I listen to all of them. And there is a set of facts that I know because I've lived them. I know exactly how the Holocaust took place because I'm an eyewitness to that. I am the one of many, who was thrown out of school because I was a Jew without doing anything wrong. I am the one whose father was taken away, his business taken away from him because he was a Jew. That's a fact. And the moment you say this never happened, we have no conversation.
And what about Irving in other areas, in more contemporary manipulation of anti-Semitism, where I don't hate Jews, I just hate Israel? Where are those facts coming from?
I was giving a talk together with my friend Qasim at Berkeley.
Mm-hmm.
And here is a group of people, students and adults. I assume they were teachers and professors and who knows what. In the middle of my speech, while I'm explaining my life, one of the women jumps up. He says, "How many people did you rape this week?" Now, this is not a conversation. Another place happens to be also in California. I get this person who happened to have been the president of Justice for Palestine while I'm speaking. And at the end of it, she says something like that. Well, as long as Jews live in Palestinian territory, we can't sit down and talk. And I said, well, I don't see that as a particular problem. If the agreement is made on borders between Israel and the Palestinian people, some Jews may be living in an area which becomes now Palestinian state. So that's not a problem. They have a choice. They can either leave or they can stay in the Palestinian territory, the Palestinian state, become citizens, pay taxes, and have equal rights. Whereupon she said, no, Absolutely not. Under no circumstances is a Jew allowed to step on Palestinian soil.
You
I
mean
said,
apartheid, real apartheid.
so I said to her, now wait a minute, let me get this thing clear. It's okay for a Muslim to live in Israel, but it's not okay for a Jew to live in Palestine. Don't you think that's not right? And suddenly she looked at me and says, oh,
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 okay.
but she wasn't convinced of anything.
No, okay. This is exactly my point. And this is why we need two things. From what I can see from this conversation, which could go on for hours because we've only just scratched the surface. And I do hope we'll have another chance to speak because I have a million other questions and like devil's advocate things to say to you both. The first thing I'm getting out of this is, and Shari, I think that we really flesh that out, is the idea that one must, in order to combat anti-Semitism with the new anti-Semitism and have our people standing proudly, we have to know what we stand for, what our values are. We have to celebrate them. We have to under focus on everything else and over focus on what we're meant to bring into the world, which unfortunately makes those who are evil hate us. That's number one. Number two, Irving, we need witnesses like you, which are quickly, I mean, you're still a young man. Thank God you should live till 125 and continue to teach and lecture and be well. But our witnesses are disappearing. So we have to be witnesses to the witnesses.
Okay.
That's all of our job. And the third I'm hearing is that we must search for truth. By doing what Irving said, we must listen to all sides of the equation and then seek the facts. And Jewish sources are one thing, but Shari, one of the things I have to say, and it's devil's advocate, if you don't believe that those sources are real, who cares?
Well, now, for instance, to give you an idea, there's a book written by a British lady on the history of Islam. It's a short book, a couple of 100 pages, and she goes back to the formation of Islam and goes through the whole process, and pretty accurately, she's a historian. But then in the historical facts, as she quotes them, and they're true, says, well, you have to understand there were problems, and therefore we went ahead and murdered all the Jewish men and sold them children and women into slavery. And that was okay? No, that's fine. That's okay. It's not a problem. I say, oops, that's not a problem. That's okay.
Okay. So, of
And
course,
that is the issue. That's why I get upset about things. Now,
I understand, but
let
I've
me
got
give
a
you,
kid.
let me
You know,
bring
I've
it
got
to, let me bring it to today.
Okay.
Okay. There's something called Black Lives Matter.
Oh, I don't want to go there.
No, I must tell you this because it's important to understand. I read the original platform. It's 100 and some odd pages long. There
Yes,
is a
I've also
bunch of
read it.
paragraphs. There are a bunch of paragraphs which speaks of foreign policy. And what it has in it, it says Israel must be destroyed because it's an apartheid state, and Israel practices genocide.
Irving, I'm going to
That
stop
to
you
me,
and I'm going to
that
tell
to me
you,
is not a starter.
I know, but you have to understand, and this is the fact is that yes, that is in there, and yes, the Hezbollah has like mandates about killing Jews and ending Israel, and yes, and yes, and yes, and also the majority of people who attach themselves to Black Lives Matter are simply people who believe in the Jewish value of unity without uniformity and not wanting the persecution of blacks. So all I'm saying is I've got a son who is a very learned kid who could chapter and verse tell me where we did things in our history that would be morally questionable today. So what I'm looking to find is, yes, what happened in the Holocaust happened. Yes. And you are a witness, and denial of that is disgusting. And Jew
No,
hatred
it's
has
more than
always
disgusting.
existed.
It's
And the Torah
denying
tells
history.
us that.
It's denying history. The moment you say
denying
that,
history.
you're denying history. And the moment you deny history, then we cannot have a conversation, because then
So-
everything you say becomes tainted.
So then, Irving, there you go. One of the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah is that we don't speak where we won't be heard. And there is so much more to say here. Shari, the work that you and Irving have done, I hope that everybody watches your film. Irving, my prayer is that every human being who watches your loss of your brother sees themselves as your brother and lives for your edel, beautiful, wonderful, holy brother, and for you. And Shari, that you have the strength to continue the work that you do in the world, which is so, so powerful. And that most of all, we look to see what it is that makes us unique as Jews. The best way to combat hate is to show and be, as Gandhi said, the change you wish to see in the world, be it yourself. There will always, God told us, be Jew hatred, because we will always represent what is right. So start representing what's right. And I'm sorry we have run out of town. I want to thank both of you for sharing your wisdom with us today. Irving and Shari, it was an honor, and there are so many more things I wish I could ask you. This conversation has been profoundly moving. There's so many questions and comments that I wasn't able to get to, and I apologize. I hope I can host you again and your questions again. Thank you to all of you.